back.
Ándale, ándale.
Right. Oh, that my motorcycle with me. He's a safe driver. He's by himself.
This has got 4 wheels instead of 2.
No, it's not your fault.
Bye, world!
Not that bad.
Have fun!
Watch out, Jake! Watch out, Jake! Turn your key on. It should start over here.
Once your light's on, the key's on.
Where's Marcia sitting?
Don't rev it yet. Okay. And now you're in there.
Oh, that's her. Here she comes.
Molly, get out of the way. Don't get in the way.
Berta!
What?
Berta!
What?
Oh.
Here we are.
Here they are. She made it back in one piece. So is Tim. There goes Berta. Laura, Mom!
Well, she's going alone. She's braver than I am.
Watch out for the dog.
My mom used to race
Oh,
snowmobiles.
come on.
Did you know that?
She had the left wheel off the ground.
Dad, it's fun.
She was in her 30s. I told Art that one. Mr. Waitress is driving. Mr. Waitress is driving.
Find you and no one's on the trail. I said, easy, can't be going that fast. His dad's on the fast. How long is that going? About 45? He does.
I must have been going about 10.
Everybody move out of the way.
It's straight off over here now.
Oh dear.
That's got to be a sight.
Oh
100 pounds versus 4.
Yeah. That's what it's like. You need to go by Leslie over there. Come on, your sleeves. In case you go over. Okay,
Right.
Marshall.
Stop though. Hold on.
Good job, Marshall. Okay. You ready? Okay.
Okay.
Hey, wait.
Birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Marshall. Happy birthday to you. I can see the art. Isn't staring.
Make
Oh, wait, that camera picked that up.
Make a wish first.
Okay.
Alright.
All right.
He wants a big drink.
Marshall, you missed one on the
Marshall's
table.
hot. Pretty good.
He's not gonna go for it.
Okay.
Can I lick one?
Should we do the other cake?
Yes, but be careful.
For the
No, let's do
I know
Marshall's.
how. I know how.
Well, then we can have the chocolate.
sure there's no-
Okay. All right. I see you.
Happy daughter, my
a little dangerous.
headphones for that CD player Christy gave you about a year ago. Okay, that's me and Dad too, Marshall. The motorcycle paper's from me and Dad too.
Oh! Gets excited.
Do you know what it is, Marshall?
Look, I goes on the track!
I didn't think you knew what it was at first. You just sat there looking at it like, ooh, gosh. Okay, Marshall, why don't you just finish up the motorcycle paper ones, because those are me and Dad too. Finish up the motorcycle paper ones.
Here. This one's from you too. Feels like a shirt. Soft?
Underwear. Yeah. Briefs.
Under.
Yeah, right. Did you get him the Barbie ones that I had?
Boxes.
Yeah, the Barbie underwear.
Yes.
What is it?
Woo!
Hey, a beach ball.
The big beach ball that you wanted. Okay, there should be one more from me and Dad.
Forgot the biggest one.
Oh.
What are you thinking? Huh? As he throws it, hopefully none of these are breakable.
Me, Uncle Rick. Were you laughing at me trying to turn around?
He's still in shock.
Race car! Race cars again! No? Do they have a real motor? They have a real motor? I was hoping the big one! Like, so open the big one! Don't wait! Thank you, Mom and Dad.
You're welcome. Uh-oh.
was that?
I didn't do it.
No one was near.
I didn't do it!
I think
happened,
she gets,
Phoebe? I didn't do
I
it!
think she goes to scratch and gets her foot stuck in her hair or something.
I know, she does that. I don't know what.
Her butt stuck in her hair.
Open the
Hey.
She gets a tangle in her hair and gets caught.
When she,
I really was.
Angie gave her a bath at one time and didn't put any conditioner in it, and she went to scratch herself, and she got her back leg stuck up by her ear. She's like, yeah, I can't get my leg down. Yeah. She was all tangled up.
Okay, who's this one from? Who's it from, Marshall?
She wrote marshmallow. Says, I hope your day
from
explodes.
Angie
And who else?
and Christy
And?
Kimmy
And
Rick
and
One more.
oh Dominic
You're supposed to read that, Marshall, not just try to guess.
You know,
Okay,
with
come
that,
on.
that new hairdo of yours, you look kind of like a marshmallow now.
Yeah.
now open the cleanser.
a nice
Honey,
Have a
it's,
marshmallow burn on the sides though.
Toasted.
his hair from me.
that's from you, Spencer?
I think it's from
It's 5.
me. 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 Angie.
No. Sound it out, honey.
Wait. And also me.
Really easy.
T.
R.
Art.
There you go.
Art and Grandma.
Okay.
Okay, now you can open the present.
Both those boxes with the Toy Story paper are for Martin and Grandma, Marshall.
Gotta find somewhere to open it. Ooh, looks like something good. Looks like new Lego. Now you don't have to freeze your car.
Yeah. Yeah. Cars have to go in the freezer now.
Thank
Leslie's going.
Oh. I was trying to freeze it. Okay, next box was from the Toy Story paper, honey.
Marshall was trying to freeze it?
The big one.
I thought for sure it was Spencer.
No, it was Marshall.
It was Marshall, the one who should know better. Oh, there's Kimmy. Cleaning up.
It's Sky! And a Volkswagen!
He got two. Maybe he'll share, huh, Spence?
car.
Cool.
All right.
Cruiser.
Thank you.
She was so for 5 cents.
Well, I'm glad mine didn't count.
You were hustling.
Are those
Ah.
stickers?
It was our daughters.
They're all fruit.
Ocean.
I don't know why I thought that just. Dollar bill. Dollar bill.
Oh, good, Spencer. I got the video going. He's grabbing himself. right in the middle of it.
Now it's
There's Dominic. There he is.
it's time.
There he is. Hey now. Well, watch him. Oh, Dominic.
It's time for Auntie to open her paper.
I know. Just a minute.
Next one.
Yeah.
All right.
Let's go outside.
What'd you get?
$1.
Who's that from?
Name two.
Oh, did your Uncle Mark give you money? Wow. It's okay, Mom. It's all right. He's just dragging his feet, honey. Hi, Iris. Here's Iris, Lily. Oh, it's a good picture, Iris. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Who loves you? Honey, read the inside. Who's it from?
Are you chucking?
I can't even see it. Baby hugs.
Listen, the pressure. The pressure.
I was like, are you in pain? Marshall's not too. Oh gosh.
Next time I feel a little bit better, then talk.
There goes the scary drivers.
Oh. Oh, and Marshall going. Gosh, we're almost taking Dominic on the train. I know.
There they come! Woo!
Here we come.
Look at that four-wheel driver.
Christy's turn to go for a ride.
All right.
Spencer wants to ride it.
Can Spencer go for a ride?
Now Spencer's gonna ride Dominic's four-wheeler.
Pull it, and it pops. Yep, turn it off. Lift your head back for me, please.
What are you doing, Dominic?
Hi, Liz. You're fine. Whistle. Wait, whistle. Spencer, I'm gonna drive out the driveway, okay?
Let Angie drive. I let Christy drive Angie. Why do I keep doing? Marcia and Spencer, you guys go. I'll get you on the video. Mom and Dad at Mesa Verde. Not Dad yet. There he is. Gonna make a picture.
Sorry.
There's everybody at Mesa Verde still. Spencer, come on, honey. You waiting in line, Marshall?
No, honey, I'm not gonna come down.
Here goes Marshall down the hall.
Not down on my back.
Keep going, Marshall, all the way, honey.
Okay.
Here goes Dad.
Downstairs. Turn around. Okay, now start climbing down. Yes, you do.
Keep going, Spencer. Go with Daddy. Daddy will carry you.
Bailey, let's wait till they get out. It might be getting a little crowded down there.
It's a little crowded.
It's not that big. Just wait.
Why?
Because you're not allowed.
Jared, when you guys get up.
Because they put their fire in that little hole, huh?
What?
Their fire.
That's a chimney here. Huh?
Daddy got a bunch of dirt on your buddy. Dad! Hey, Steven?
Spencer.
I wish we could climb the whole thing and go inside.
Wait, Marshall, get back down here. Hurry up. Spencer, do your rock. Quick.
I can't make them
Just real quick. There they are. What are you guys making? There's my boys with their dad. Getting in trouble. Marshall found this at Mesa Verde.
Okay, Robert, let's go find
Can I pay him?
Okay.
What?
Can I pay him?
Okay.
She's up there.
Let him put him back on the wall where he was, Marshall.
Marshall, can I pay him?
Leave him there, Robert.
There we go.
Leave him
No,
alone,
don't
Robert.
put him anymore, Spencer.
No, Robert. Leave him there. Leave him
Hey,
there.
Mom!
She's way over there.
Hey, Mommy! Do I have like all the building ones? All the building?
As you can kind of see how they would have
This is the Cliff Palace.
The arranger guide for your 432 or full pallet set.
you can just call me Ranger Joseph. That's probably easier. I was raised in Fort Collins, Colorado. Now I live in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where I'm finishing my doctoral dissertation in history. A history of Pueblo peoples and the Pueblo heritage parks like Mesa Verde. So I will be talking to you about Pueblo history as we go through this site this afternoon. And as most of you are from European descent, to make it interesting, I'll contrast life here in the 13th century to life in Europe in the 13th century, and then compare both to life today, to give you perhaps a unique view on how life was, or what life was like back here. But before we begin, I do need to tell you about the tour you are about to embark upon. It is a strenuous walk. We're going to drop 125 feet into the canyon on metal and stone steps. We'll gain that back on stone steps and 4 10-foot wooden ladders. You can see the last wooden ladder across from us in that crevice. You'll be on that ladder yourselves in about an hour from now. We're going to climb the last 100 feet very quickly. It's very steep. You're climbing at 7,000 feet in elevation. There's less oxygen here, and as you climb out, you'll probably be huffing and puffing. If your doctor has warned you to avoid strenuous exercise, this is what he was talking about. If you have a history of heart disease or respiratory illness, please consider it carefully before going down. You are on vacation, you're supposed to be having fun, and a medical emergency here is no fun. So consider it carefully before going down. Now, how many of you have heard that the people who lived here vanished or disappeared? Okay, that's a myth that we're trying to dispel. Archaeologists have never believed that. Pueblo peoples have never believed it, as it was their ancestors who lived here in the 13th century. When I say Pueblos, that's a name the Spanish gave the village tribes of the Southwest, New Mexico, and Arizona. You might know them by other names, such as Hopi, Zuni, Acoma, Taos, Isleta, Zia, Tesuque, and a dozen other villages of the Rio Grande Valley. To these modern Pueblos, Mesa Verde is a very special place. Many would call it sacred, as their ancestors lived, died, and were buried here over 7 centuries. They do come back periodically to pray. For many school children, Mesa Verde is a special place. They've grown up with pictures of Cliff Palace in their history books. And for peoples around the world, Mesa Verde is special. They've honored us by making Mesa Verde a World Heritage Site. So we ask your help in preserving Mesa Verde for future generations. While we are in the village, I will ask that you not sit, stand, or climb on the walls. Please do not jump about, as that compacts the soil. Do not enter any of the rooms, and be careful what you touch, as that does leave behind the oils from your skin, which turns the rocks black over the years. You'll see some very black rocks down there that has happened to. We ask there be no food or drink in the dwelling. Water's fine if you wish to bring water. However, sugar drinks, if spilled, will attract mice and ants that burrow down and destabilize the walls. We ask there be no tobacco products or gum chewing for similar reasons. If you'd leave any of those things behind in this trash can before starting down, it would be appreciated. With your help, we'll be able to preserve Cliff Palace for future generations. Now, how many of you are farmers today? One? That's a little bit more than I usually get. Now, how many of your ancestors were farmers in the 13th century? That's pretty much everyone, unless you're claiming royalty. Your ancestors are probably farmers. They were farmers in Europe, they were farmers here. But for those of us who don't farm these days, it's hard to understand what life is like. You worked from sunrise to sunset in the fields to bring in a crop. Now here was a very good place to farm. In fact, we find the best farming conditions for 100 miles here in Mesa Verde. The soil on top of the mesa where their fields were is a very fine agricultural soil, referred to as a loess soil by geologists, L-O-E-S-S. It is windblown from Arizona and Utah, very fertile, it holds moisture well, and it's 8 foot deep in the middle of the mesa. A wonderful place to farm. At 7,000 feet in elevation, we gather more moisture than the surrounding valleys. 18 inches a year here in Mesa Verde compared to 13 inches around Cortez. so this was a good place to farm. And they farmed here for 7 centuries, roughly from 600 AD to 1300 AD. To put that in terms of European guideposts, that's between the fall of the Roman Empire and the end of the Crusades. What's popularly known to most Americans as the Dark Ages, or the Middle Ages. That's when Pueblo peoples were living in Mesa Verde. 700 years is a long time and a lot changed. Over those years, they began hunting with the bow and arrow. They traded with peoples from far away, from California for seashells, with peoples of Mexico for macaws and copper bells. Their architecture changed most notably. At first, they were living in single-room dwellings dug into the earth, called a pit house. It had an adobe roof supported by 4 posts. But over time, they experimented with stone, wood, and adobe mortar. And by 1000 AD, we're building full-fledged Pueblo villages on the mesas of Mesa Verde. If you drive the Mesa Top Drive today, you will see examples of those earlier villages along the way. And then about 1200 AD, something happened. Things changed and they began to move their villages off the mesas and into the alcoves, in the canyons, in the cliffs, to become cliff dwellers, as is popularly said. To understand why they might have moved, gaze out across the canyon at the opposite mesa and tell me what you see there today that you would not expect to see in 1200 AD after 600 years of farming. Trees. 600 years of cutting the forests for fields, for village construction, and for firewood. Firewood is important, as January temperatures can drop well below zero, and we'll have from 80 to 100 inches of snow over the course of the winter on average. If you build a fire on the mesa top, where does the heat go? Up into the night sky. You build a fire back in an alcove, like the alcove where Cliff Palace is located, and you build walls in front of it. Where does the heat go? It stays right there. If they were facing a fuel crisis, and we have every reason to believe they did, it would have made good sense to move into the alcoves where you did not have to burn as much wood. They were out of the rain and snow. In addition, most of the alcoves have springs behind them. You find water throughout the canyons, not in the canyons, for that's dry most of the year. But where the sandstone and shale comes together, that's where you find the springs. And when that freezes, it cracks the sandstone and forms the alcoves. So most of these alcoves have springs behind them. Cliff Palace does. That's where you go for water. It's also a great place to store food, as we'll talk about down below. And so for these reasons, we think they moved, not because there was an invader and they were being attacked, but we think they moved these days because it made good sense given the resources that they had left in 1200 AD. After all, Europeans faced a similar crisis about 1200. They had cut down their forest. Europeans solved their problem by turning to coal as a fuel. Now that's an option the Pueblo peoples would not take until the 14th or 15th century. It seems their first response was to move into the alcoves and build the cliff houses you've come to see. If you follow me now, we'll go down and take a look.
You're the one who said the other day, far enough back to the wood.
Come on, I want to get the ladder.
Just stand right here on your floor.
Daddy,
I'm going to get you guys climbing up the ladder. Spencer, go on.
Here, here. Okay.
You go ahead. No, go ahead. I want to get your picture. I'll come. I'll come when you're done.
Don't be scared.
I won't. You guys can go. I'll go in.
going up. Look, come on. Are we almost there yet? I can't touch the wall.
Grandma, pop up the ladder.
Grandma's doing good.
Yeah. She's cruising.
Yeah. 4 foot. Like somebody you know or thought.
No, it was 10. It was 4 10-foot ladders, not 10 4-foot ladders. Just kind of mixed up a little.
A little.
What?
Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s, one of President Roosevelt's most popular New Deal programs. They built the entrance trail we use and the exit trail. However, nearby you will see evidence of the Pueblo Trail that the Puebloans used to get here. Where I collected the tickets at the gate, they would have come down the crevice to your left. Along the exit trail, you will see one of the hand and toehold trails you might have heard about. They pegged small stairs or steps into the cliffs. We call them hand and toeholds. And then using those hand and toeholds, they climbed up to the mesa top to get to their fields each day. I will tell you at our final stop where to look to see those hand and toeholds. And when you see them, some of you might think how dangerous, how precarious were these tiny steps. Or if you're a rock climber like myself, you're likely to think, how sissy. I've been out on their trail over a dozen times, and it's really pretty easy once you get used to it. It was scary the first time. Driving a car was scary the first time, too. Driving a car is more dangerous, because you'll go 70 miles an hour in a car faster than they would have obtained had they fallen off the cliff. We all do dangerous things to get to work. It's just a matter of perspective. You get used to the danger after a while, and they probably got used to the danger here. Not to say that they never got hurt. They could have broken a couple of bones that way. But these days we also get hurt driving our cars, so we all do dangerous things. That's how they got to the alcove. Now the alcove itself is natural, formed by the freezing and thawing of the rock. The village they built here was entirely built in the 13th century. To give you landmarks, again, in European history, in England, that was the time of Robin Hood, of King John, of Richard the Lionheart. That's when they were building this village here. In Europe, in England, they were building castles at that time out of limestone. They built Cliff Palace out of sandstone. The two rocks are very similar. Both are sedimentary, and both are very soft, easy to shape with a harder rock. In Europe, they had metal tools. Here, all it took was a harder stone. And a walk down this canyon would take you to the Mancos River that drains the La Plata Peaks near Durango. Those peaks are made of igneous and metamorphic rock, very hard. So with one of those cobblestones hafted to an oak branch, they had a kind of hammer, like the ones we found and are on display in the museum. And with those hammers, they cut the stone to shape it, leaving behind the dimples we'll see on the rock, indicating where it was struck by a harder stone. When the stones were shaped, they were stacked and held in place with a mud mortar. Europeans were using cement, first invented by the Romans, but here the mud worked very well. Made from the dirt of the canyons mixed with water, it is high in clay and sand and is a very good binding agent. In fact, the mud works so well that our modern preservation crew prefers to use the mud to stabilize the walls rather than cement. You'll see some cement here. That's from the 1908 stabilization by Dr. Fuchs. But for the last 30 years, we've been using the mud, and we've learned it works just as well. And when the walls were finished, they were coated with the plaster, made from that adobe mud, just like the Europeans plastered their walls. They had three colors, a red, a yellow, and a white, depending on the soil used. You'll see a lot of red plaster to the north and middle sections of the village, and up above some white. When the plaster dried, it was painted with elaborate designs we call pictographs these days. Europeans were also painting their plaster. That's how Michelangelo painted his masterpiece in the Sistine Chapel, by painting the plaster. Now, we don't know if they had artists of that caliber here, and unfortunately we'll never know, because most of those paintings washed away over the centuries when rain and snow blew back in. Particularly at Cliff Palace, for it has such a wide opening. If you go to Spruce Tree House today, you'll see many more examples of pictographs there than you'll find here. That's because that cliff dwelling has much smaller opening, and wind and rain does not get blown back as much. Ceilings, floors, roofs, and balconies were built in the same fashion, and you have to think of all these rooms as being roofed. But again, we don't find many roofs here. You do at Spruce Tree House or Balcony House. Roofs are built in a fashion very similar to the way Europeans were building them. Heavy timbers were laid across the walls in one direction. We call them vigas. Then smaller timbers were laid across those, called latillas. Then a layer of juniper bark and rabbit brush as thatch. To that point, that's exactly like the European roofs. But then they coated it with 4 to 6 inches of mud here. The reason being is they used those roofs as workspace, and with a mud roof you could walk across. Europeans pitched their roofs to keep the rain and snow off. That would not be a concern back in an alcove like this one. And the flat roofs are used today among the pueblos as a workspace, what we call courtyards or plazas. Because this is a very narrow village, that additional workspace was probably very important. Now when they arrived, the floor of the alcove was very uneven. Large boulders were strewn about, and the grade was about 60%. It was very steep. So their first task was to build a level surface on which to build a village. So they built the walls in front. They serve as retaining walls, and once in place they backfilled behind with debris and rubble to create a level surface for their village. And into that rubble they dug their kivas. Kivas are the round subterranean rooms we see across from us, used in ceremonies. We'll speak of them in greater depth at our final stop when we get over there. Notice this 3-story structure is built on a boulder that is cracking. That worried archaeologists, and in the 1930s, they went under there with 70 tons of cement and steel to shore it up. And in the process, they found an earlier Puebloan wall there, indicating the Pueblos were equally concerned about that boulder slipping and damaging their village. To the right, you see a lot of original plaster and some original wood. And then you come to this round tower, very round, within 3 inches of a perfect circle. It has impressed modern stonemasons. Each stone is cut to taper as it went up, and appears to have been a special building. However, we can only guess at its function. For when the Wetherells arrived, they were a cowboy family, and when they came here in 1888, all they reported inside was a stone axe. A very poor clue for guessing room function. So we don't know how that room was used. However, it gave the Wetherells a name for the site. It reminded them of European castles, and so they called it Cliff Palace. However, it was not a palace. In fact, it was probably not even much of a village, but we think an administrative center, as I'll talk about at the end of the tour, or perhaps a religious site as well. To the right of that very round tower, you'll see a very square tower. The walls are so vertical they suggest the use of a plumb bob. A simple invention, Europeans had it as well. You simply tie a rock to the string, and that shows you where the vertical lies. You build your wall to the string, and your wall's perfectly vertical. To build a level wall, simply take a pot, paint a line equidistant from the bottom of the pot, fill that pot with water, set it on a log on the wall, and when the water sits on the line, the wall is level. Using such techniques, again similar to European techniques, they could build walls so perfect like we see in that very square building across from us. To the right of it is a 4-story tower. Now people often ask how much restoration was done. How much did the National Park Service rebuild of this village? Usually it's very little. In fact, here it's probably 80% original Pueblo construction. However, early pot hunters had punched holes in the walls, and those were repaired. And that 4-story tower across from us had sustained the most damage. The corner closest to us, the northwest corner, had collapsed, and the other walls were in danger of falling as well. As a result, Al Lancaster rebuilt that northwest corner in 1934 to stabilize the remaining walls. So that 4-story tower has the most restoration of any structure here in this village. Most of the rest of the village is original. We refer to that as a tower. However, when the Pueblos lived here, it would not have looked that way because the walls around it would have been higher. If you look behind me in the smoke stain on the alcove ceiling, you'll see the outline of another 2-story structure, reminding us that what we see today is what has survived the centuries, and originally many of the walls may have been higher. Look in the crevice above the village now, in that ledge, the series of ledge rooms. How would you use those? Well, think about food storage for a moment. That's a challenge around the world in the 13th century. Without freezers or refrigeration, what would your food storage have to be like? Cool, what else? Dry. One other condition that's important. Safe from animals, rodents particularly. Think of that ledge. It's dry, rain and snow seldom gets blown up. It's cool, the sun seldom shines there in the afternoon. And it's safe from rodents, as mice can't climb the cliff to get inside. An excellent place for food storage. And in fact, we found corn tassels, corn cobs, and husks inside there, suggesting that use. We think a lot of the 2- and 3-room structures you'll see across the canyons, like the ones you might have noticed across from the observation deck. We think those were food storage as well, not residences. You can think of them as the 13th century equivalent to grain silos. Many of them appear difficult of access, like this one does at first, but it really wasn't hard to get to. If you look all the way to the left, you see a doorway. Beneath that door, there would have been a roof just 10 feet below. So a 10-foot ladder could have reached that doorway. And to the bottom right of the door, there's a notch cut into the sandstone, believed to be cut there to hold the ladder in place. Once inside that door, a passage connects all the rooms. But they're interesting. There's a large room to the north and a large room to the south, with small rooms in between. Mirroring the village that has tall rooms to the north and tall rooms to the south, with small rooms in between. That symmetry has been commented upon and may reveal something of the social structure of this village. But I'll talk about that at our second stop. For now, are there any questions about construction of the village? Techniques that mirror European techniques of that century. Are filling up and we don't know where we'll put our trash next. Where did Europeans put their trash in the 13th century? Middle of the road? Yeah, right out front. They just simply threw it into the streets and forgot about it. Out of sight, out of mind. The Pueblos here did the same thing. Trash was simply thrown out front, right where you're standing, so this is often referred to as the trash bin. You have to consider that trash is really not invented until the 20th century. Until then, most people don't see it as trash, but it's simply what's left over. It comes from nature, so it returns to nature. Of course, these days, our trash doesn't return to nature so easily. Times have changed, certainly. And I like to stop here in the middle of the village to allow you to look up at the walls. It gives us a different view of what's happening in this village. To the north, you see that 3-story structure again, but from a different angle. There was a lot of original plaster up there, and that's what that scaffolding is for. The University of Pennsylvania this summer is undergoing a study trying to determine how best to preserve the plaster that yet remains. The wood up there, however, is not original. That's stabilization. The wood down low that you see above me here, those are original timbers placed there by the Pueblos. Now this 3-story structure was called the Speaker Chief's House by Dr. Fuchs, the archaeologist who worked here in 1908. He called it the Speaker Chief's House because he thought that there was a chieftainship here. However, these days, most archaeologists would dispute that, seeing instead evidence for clans or moieties. And that's how we think the village structured itself now. Clans and moieties are often difficult concepts. Let me describe them both. How many of you live in families these days? Pretty much everyone. Well, what's a family for you? Mother, father, and kids? That's a poor family in the 13th century. And the reason I say that is because life was short. The average life expectancy for a man here was 35. What was the life expectancy for a man in Europe? 35, roughly. For a woman here, it was 25, the same in Europe. How come women lived an average of 10 years less than a man? Childbirth, right, and that was dangerous. Infant mortality was 50% here and in Europe, meaning half the children would die before they were 5 years old. Now what's causing people to die here and in Europe? And around the world, what's the biggest cause of death in the 13th century?
Expensive.
Infections, disease, yes. In Europe, smallpox, measles, and the plague. Here we know they face tuberculosis and diphtheria. Other diseases are likely too, but we don't see evidence of those, so we're not sure. But certainly colds, fevers, and pneumonia were life-threatening diseases in the 13th century. Life's very uncertain when you without modern medicine. That's not to say people did not live to be old. Again, skeletal evidence suggests that men and women could get to be their 60s or 70s, maybe even 80. But if you lived to be old, you were in pain a lot of the time. As you got old, you had arthritis and rheumatism. And with the cold winters, that could be painful. To make it worse, they ate corn, or cornmeal, that was ground on a mano and metate, these grinding stones here. If you grind on a sandstone mano and metate, you get sand bread in your meal, and that sand would wear down the teeth. So they faced tooth decay as they grew old as well. Life was very hard in the 13th century. Europeans faced tooth decay too. They didn't have any better dentistry. But you could be miserable. Children might grow up without their parents, as their parents would die at a young age. And if you did grow old, you needed young people around to take care of you. True here and in Europe and Asia and around the world. So that's why people didn't live in modern families, but in clans, or what we call sometimes extended families. Children didn't live just with their parents, but with their grandparents, their uncles and aunts, great-uncles, great-aunts, cousins, second cousins, third cousins, nieces, nephews, children and grandchildren, and what we call an extended family or a clan. And then if your parents died, which was likely, your aunts and uncles would take you in. If you grew old, your children and grandchildren were there to comfort you. And the clans worked perhaps even better than Social Security works today, to take care of people and their needs. The Western Pueblos today, Acoma, Hopi, Zuni, still live in clans. And the clans will make decisions for themselves, and a council of clans will make decisions for the village. Archaeologists find what we call a unit type for a clan. A kiva and the room block surrounding it, including the roof of the kiva, as a courtyard. We call that a unit. We find it throughout the Southwest. And the suggestion each unit was for a clan. Here in Cliff Palace we find 22 kivas, suggesting possibly 22 clans. Although not all of them may have been residing in this village, as I'll talk about later. In addition, we find evidence of moieties. Now, moiety is an anthropological term for a society that divides itself in half. The eastern Pueblos use moieties today. The Carasons divide themselves into squash and turquoise, the Tanawins into winter and summer halves. Taos Pueblo is the best example of that. It's Tanawin. And the winter-summer moieties there are divided by a creek that flows through the village into two halves. A wall behind the wall above me divides this village in half. It's very hard to get from the north half to the south. Spruce tree house is divided in half, long houses, balcony house. And we see this evidence of halves or moieties in the archaeological evidence here. The way that works among the Tanawins is the summer moiety will govern the village from spring equinox to fall and will be responsible for the agricultural ceremonies. Fall equinox, the winter moiety takes over and governs till the spring, and they're responsible for the hunting ceremony. When a person dies, it's the opposite moiety that buries them. And there's other reciprocal obligations between the moieties. Again, the moieties govern themselves by councils of elders. Both clans and moieties might have been present here. We find evidence of both. And one theory would say they both are derived from the 13th century tribal villages, like Cliff Palace. Clans and moieties are very egalitarian in their system. They make decisions on consensus. In those councils they gather, and when everyone agrees, they do things. They don't have a dictator or a third authoritarian system where one person's the boss and bosses everyone around. Instead, it's a very democratic system. It appears that Pueblo peoples really believed that all men were created equal, whereas Europeans at that time tended to believe that some people were better than others, and those were the ruling classes. But the Pueblos, even today, are very egalitarian. Now, if I speak of clans, you have to think of marriage. The most common rule of marriage in a clan system is you must marry outside your clan. If you read Tony Hillerman's novels, you're aware of all that. Now, where would you meet a woman in a village like Cliff Palace? Any guesses? Where did you meet women in the 13th century? In small villages worldwide.
Another village.
Fields?
Stealing from another village.
Most common place to meet them was at the water holes. Creeks, riverbanks, springs. Here there's a spring behind this village, but you don't want to meet her there because all these ears are listening. And in fact, there's a better spring across the canyon at that point of rock beneath Sun Temple. Around the world, it's young unmarried women that fetch the water and return it in pots, often on their heads. So if the young unmarried women were at the spring over there, where would you find the young unmarried men? Okay, you're catching my drift. But how do you court a woman in the 13th century? How do you let her know you like her? Okay. Think of Spain and Italy. They serenade, they use music, lutes and flutes and guitars. Among Pueblo peoples these days, there's courtship songs for Native American flute. Some of those songs are very old. And we find flutes here in the dwellings of Mesa Verde. Badly damaged in the ruins, we have found flutes. So they had flutes then, and perhaps they were used in similar ways as today. So a man would go there perhaps and wait for the woman that he liked to come by, and then would play a song to catch her eye. Then maybe he'd volunteer to carry that water for her. But I like to think that he wouldn't carry it into the village because if he did, all these men would jeer him. So he probably gave it back to her right before they came in. Who knows? I'm speculating, obviously. But if they decided to spend their lives together, what would it take? Not just their decision, right? If you have a clan system, whose decision is it? It's the clans, the whole family that's involved. The reason being, among Pueblos these days, they're matrilineal and matrilocal. The men will move in with the women's family. If you think of what that means for these unit types, all the women living together are related. They're sisters or aunts or mothers. But the men have moved in as strangers from different types. Now, if you're going to move in with your wife's family, she better like you, or life's going to be miserable. So that's why we see it as a clan decision. And even among modern Pueblos, that's the way it is. In Europe in the 13th century, the same was true. I know children don't like to think about their parents having such a say in marriage, but when they don't, it created problems in Europe. Think of Romeo and Juliet. Their families did not get along, and so that romance was headed for tragedy. We don't know if they had such tragedies like that here, but maybe so. We have to speculate. What I invite you to remember is that these are human beings in a human village with human emotions. And so such tragedies may in fact have taken place. We can't discount the human emotion of the past. Marriage suggests ritual and ceremony. And to speak of those in greater depth, let's gather around the kivas next, and we'll talk about religion more. But are there any... We know of churches and how they're used because churches are still used today. And churches and kivas are rather synonymous, very similar to each other. The main use for a church is for religion, ritual, prayer, and ceremony. The main use for kivas these days is for religion, ritual, prayer, and ceremony. But those uses are not exclusive. In the 13th century, churches had a political use. And when the king came to town, he would hold court in a cathedral, and his subjects would visit him there. Among the Pueblos, the kivas have a political use. The elders will gather in a kiva to make decisions for the clan or the village. In Europe, children would go to the cathedrals for instruction by the priests. Among the Pueblos, children would go to the kivas for instruction by their elders, or often the priests. In Europe, the cathedrals are places to meet, to socialize, the center of life in the village. Among the Pueblos, the kivas are places to socialize when there's no ceremony in progress. And when a visitor comes to town, he's first welcomed in a kiva, traditionally. So they're rather synonymous structures, very similar to each other, and in more ways as well. In Europe, cathedrals were works of art, requiring new technology to support the roof. In Europe, that required flying buttresses. Here, the kivas were works of art, as I'll explain, requiring new technology to support the roof, because they did not have a lot of tall timbers to roof a room this large. They had to find another way. And what they did was create a cribbed roof. and rested the weight of it on the 6 stone pilasters we find in the kiva. Logs were circled from pilaster to pilaster. When the first, please don't kick around like that. I don't want you to hit the plaster. But logs were circled, and when the first circle of logs was in place, they built a second circle on top by cutting corners on the first, going from the middle of one first timber to the middle of the timber next to it. If you do that, the second circle has a smaller circumference, as would the third and the fourth, and they would slowly close an opening to the kiva by giving it a slightly domed effect on the inside. When they reached ground level, single timbers bridged any remaining gap, leaving a whole 2-foot square for the ladder to enter and for the smoke to escape. Then they covered the entire roof with adobe mud to create a surface that you could walk on and work on. That's what we call the courtyard space for this clan unit. Now, if you go to Spruce Tree House today, you'll see 3 kivas with their roofs restored by the Park Service. 2 will show you the courtyard as it would have appeared, and you can see that would be a good place to work. The third you can enter. When you climb down inside, look up at the roof, and you'll see what I've described to you. Many people call it or consider it a work of art. The intricate pattern of wood, all polished with your hands, does create a very nice design. Now, they entered the kiva by ladder through the smoke hole. Smoke would have enveloped them as they descended. But not to worry. How did Europeans use smoke in their cathedrals in the 13th century?
Purify.
As what?
Purify.
To purify it, as incense. Incense is used. There's a rich tradition of that, and that purifies the church. Pueblo peoples also use smoke to purify as incense, particularly cedar smoke, which is the most common wood found here in Mesa Verde. So in this design, you would have been automatically purified for any ceremony as you descended. Notice there's a chimney in this kiva, right behind you actually for those sitting here. But it has a chimney. All the kivas do. Europeans had chimneys in their houses too, but they did not perfect the concept. The Pueblos did back in the 13th century. You see, they didn't build their fires in the chimney. If you do that, where does the heat go? Up the chimney, and you have to burn more wood. Pueblos built their fires in the middle of the room and used the entryway as a smoke hole. That creates a vacuum in the room, and that vacuum draws fresh air down the chimney. So we call the chimney here a ventilator shaft. And thus these are the best ventilated rooms in the village. The draft of fresh air would come out the opening beneath with such force that if that wall was not there, the draft would have blown over the fire pit and scattered ashes and sparks. The deflector wall prevents that from happening and causes that draft to circulate uniformly throughout the room. Europeans would eventually create a similar concept when Ben Franklin created the Franklin stove, which heats the same way by putting the fire in the middle of the room. Now, what appears to be a bench in the kiva was probably not a bench, for with the roof in place on top of the pilasters, if you sat there, your head would have hit the ceiling. They probably sat on the floor and used the bench as a shelf or maybe a closet space. At least they could sit. In European cathedrals, most of the peasants had to stand, as only the rich could afford the pews. The niches that we see in the lower walls, we think were for more sacred objects. Today among some pueblos, they're used for sacred things like pajos, prayer feathers and prayer sticks. And the same might have been true in the 13th century. Just like the niches in European cathedrals that were also used for sacred objects, often images of the saints. The wider shelf to the south, called the southern recess, might have been used as a kind of altar, a concept that would have been understood by Europeans as well. Now, the very shape of the kiva suggests its religious use. The shape of religious structures often reveal the thoughts of the people who build them. For example, what shapes were European cathedrals built in? In a cross shape, yes, as that's important for European peoples. So they use the cross design. The kiva suggests the sipapu. Now, many of you know the sipapu is that round hole to the side of the fire pit. Some of you call it the spirit hole, about 4 inches in diameter, 4 inches deep. It's also a religious concept for Pueblo peoples, a concept they still have today. Pueblo peoples will say that this is not the first world. Rather, there were previous worlds beneath this one. And those worlds were destroyed when the people failed to live uprightly and morally. The Hopi say this is the fourth world, the first three being destroyed by water, or by fire, ice, and flood. And like the story of Noah's Ark from the European tradition, each time the Hopi say the good people were spared. And they were led up a ladder and out through an opening in the sky to the next world. They call that opening the Sipapu. Roughly translated, it means the place of emergence. Pueblos believe that when we pass on, our spirits return to the world below, where they become the Kachina spirits that bring the rain. Now the Sipapu is placed in the kiva as that point of communication between this world and the world below. And prayers and offerings are left there. But if you think about it, the entire kiva reenacts that story. And that's the most important.
You guys behind me? Okay, I'm coming. You're open today. Wave, Spencer.
Well, you see,
How old are you today?
it's not heart that I need to
No,
tell you
how old?
today.
I can't do it.
Say 4.
It's another part of my anatomy.
Good.
And let me tell you,
You're Marshall.
I got those.
Marshall's 8 years old.
I got people out there. Look at the boy.
There's Dad. He's older than the hills.
Here's something, Bartlett. You're not as smart as you think you are.
Older than dirt. There we go.
Two infiltrators in your group.
Okay.
I don't know, Mom.
You don't know? You think it's going to be big or little?
Maybe bigger.
Maybe bigger? Maybe.
Oh!
Could be.
Oh, man! I got a ripple. Oh,
I thought you were going to help.
I couldn't.
Why?
It's hurting my arms. What about if you carry from the front? Hey, Mom. I do.
You need my help, Dad?
Hey, Mom.
What, honey? Now, how old are you again today?
4.
4, yes.
Yeah.
Spencer. Do that again. Do mommy.
What is that?
I don't know what it is. We just have to wait and see. Oh, it's killing him, Daddy. He's having a breakdown. Hey, get down.
Huh?
Get down.
What is it?
I don't know what it is.
Why those candles? Those candles.
What candles? What about them?
Okay, honey, you just have to stop.
Okay, just a minute, Sped. I think maybe Daddy's coming with your present.
You're gonna jam the back tire.
What is it? What is it, Spencer?
It's a jet.
Oh my gosh, get in it. Climb in. See how you fit.
Push the
You're
gas.
not in the driver's seat, honey.
Oh, stop.
Get in the driver's seat.
Okay, go. Go, Spence.
Alright, uh-oh.
Hey, Mom, let's put it in reverse now, Spence. And now look backwards. That's pretty
Yeah. You want to take it outside?
good. Yeah.
All right. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Spencer. Happy birthday to you. Okay. Good.
What is it?
What could it be?
Wow!
a model?
Yeah.
A little girl?
Nope.
Spencer, can you turn towards Mama when you're opening? I can't see what you're doing.
Is it the model that
What's
you
in the model of?
Hey! It's the same one, Mike. Yours, Mike. Almost
see.
the same. Almost.
Let me see. Turn it over so I can see it. Wow, that's fancy. Neat, hon. Okay, pick another one.
I will.
Throw the paper on the floor.
Let's put your present by that table. This one?
Okay, go ahead.
What is it?
I can't know.
I'll keep trying. It's gotta be somewhere. I hear it. I hear it.
Hey, Power Ranger!
What is it?
I'm not.
Oh, a Power Ranger. Oh, look at that. Hold it up so I can see.
Hold
What
it
is
up,
it?
Spencer.
Alright.
Power Rangers.
Hey,
Wow.
there's the bad guy.
There's a bad guy?
Yep.
Okay.
Okay. Are you gonna open another one? Yeah. Or are you just gonna sit there all day? This one.
That one. What is that? What's in there?
Huh. Oh, is it socks? The old underwear? The guy. The G.I. Joe.
Wow. G.I. Joe.
That was good. Mom, we have
What?
a gun.
Oh, he's an army guy.
G.I. Joe. Better stop staring at him. Gonna come hold onto your arm and make you go like this. What's this one?
That one's from Marshall. Oh, that one's from Mommy and Daddy.
Open it quick! It's probably something good.
What?
Find that open. Find something open.
Ew.
You find it.
I hear it.
What is it?
Ripping and tearing.
And killing it. Ah! I'm missing it.
What?
Look it!
What is it? Oh, what is that?
It's Army guy.
Army guy stuff.
Let me see. I can't see. Let
Cool.
me see. Oh, sweet. I've seen that before. It was an after-school care. I used to play with it. Mom,
What?
is this both of mine?
Yeah, that's all yours.
And this one?
Yeah, all of them.
Hey, there's both of them.
Yeah, go finish opening your presents,
Put up those trucks.
and then we'll open all that up so you can play with it, okay?
Why
Alright.
don't you open the other
That's
one?
from Grandma and Papa Wagers.
Why don't you open the other one first, Ben?
Daddy,
Do
can
that
you
one
start
last.
that one for
Which
him?
one?
Go ahead and open that one for Marshall. Yeah,
Yeah.
let's
You're
see.
gonna like it, Spency.
What's in there?
You're gonna poop your pants.
What'd your brother get you?
Yeah, what'd your brother get you?
Oh, this kid. Keep your pants.
Hey, don't
All
look
right.
at me. Whoa, it's
I'm gonna get a close up. There's Marshall. Smile.
No.
Come on. We're gonna watch this in a year or so. You're gonna go, why'd I do that?
Mom.
What is it?
What a dork.
Did you push the button?
Spencer, push some of the other buttons. Your car goes up and down, man. Awesome.
What about the other one? No, let Marshall show you. Show him, Marshall. Show him the car one. Okay, here comes the car one. No, not the Jeep, the car, honey.
Car.
Marshall, the car.
Car.
Look at that. See, it bounces up and down. Oh, cool. It has lights and everything.
Push the one that makes it bounce up and down again, Marshall. Isn't that funny, Spencer?
What is it? So do you like
Okay, Daddy's got Grandma and Papa's gift ready to open.
Mama.
Keep tearing.
Can I help you?
It's just the first half.
Your mom passed
Oh, you got a box.
Uh-oh, did Grandma and
Hey, can I
Papa
have
rip
it?
up a box for you?
No. I your box? Mama, can you open this?
I don't know.
Thing? That blew it big. I guess your mom doesn't want him to see it. Why am I going poop on my pants?
Hey, excuse you. Jeez.
No, you're not excused. Don't cry, you're still baby. There it is! Shirt!
Okay.
Underwear! You got some underwear for your birthday. Yay!
Well.
Keep helping him, Daddy.
Now go ahead.
You got some underwear, I told you.
Oh, you got some bubble wrap? What else is in there?
There,
What
finally
is it?
Oh,
What is it?
Spencer.
And you still got it unwrapped.
Uh-oh, present.
There's your
Spencer,
present.
unwrap it.
Oh, feel good.
Ooh, that's pretty
What
birthday
is that?
paper. Isn't that
Huh?
pretty? I like that birthday paper.
Oh!
What is it?
It's
What is it?
I don't know.
Take the card off the top and look at it.
It's a Volkswagen.
Yay! It's a Volkswagen. See, Grandma knew what you wanted, huh? Spency, where you going? Oh, you gotta go back and play with those cards?
I like that one bounce up.
Okay.
Stop cameraing. There's nothing to camera about. You smell.
Okay, Spencer.
Alright, guys.
Alright, guys. So show Daddy. He's got the camera.
All right, that looks cool.
That's your one.
Wait a minute, wait a minute.
Huh?
And look, Spencer. Look. There's pants. Pants. And what's this?
Hat.
Wow, look at you. Try the hat on for Dad. Oh, got it curled up. There you go.
Underwear that came with it.
All right.
Thanks, Daddy. You look nice.
I get the hat.
Okay. That's all. Birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Spencer. Happy birthday to you. Yay! Oh, she's gonna clean the whole thing out. There we go. Okay, keep going, Spence. Find some more. Done. There they are. Is everybody hanging out?
I'm not using it.
Okay, here we go with the Easter egg hunt. It's snowing. Here's Spencer throwing snowballs. Uh-oh. Lost him. There he is. There's Dominic holding his candy close. Spencer, get some candy!
Get in there, kids!
Spence, get some candy!
Then you have to push back.
Here we go.
Here comes Peter Cottontail. On the bunny trail. Hippity hoppity, sisters on its.
Okay, we're hunting eggs on Easter morning.
Careful.
We'll just get in the car and drive out.
Hey, put him in the car.
That's cool. There she is.
Two.
That's. What was it? Boss. Bosses. He's like, it's my dad. He's like,
Be careful with that one, I'll get it for you.
There's Tim cooking breakfast.
Almost got it. I got it.
Oh my gosh, you got them on hot.
Mine.
Yeah.
This one is yours, Spencer.
Everybody looking so happy in the morning.
You'll ruin it.
Where's Marshall at?
Angie.
Marshall's not coming up?
On my way.
On what and where?
On my way.
Yeah.
Mine, Tyler.
I know. I saw it. The first one I found.
Mine, Tyler.
Look at when you look over there. Look at my screen. Why? I think it's because of the sun, yep.
You do your best. It does not matter what you take home. You are already champions. You agree with that, kids? Excellent. Just to prove that, who's already received a trophy today? If you haven't, Mom, Dad, take that trophy coupon, head back over into the other small gym and get your kids the participation trophy. We want them to have a trophy just for being here. And kids, you see this trophy table here? You see all these trophies? Can you guys do me a favor? Can you take all of these home for me? Yes, you promise? Because I don't want to pack them up and put them in that big ugly yellow.
This trophy's right beside you.
Parents, as these kids start winning medals, it is important that you keep all awards they get with your medals and trophies. When you want to let them wear the medals to the next event, or walk around in an aisle or race, something like that. So please make sure you keep all of these awards.
Second call for those 8-year-olds, strongest punchers.
Another group of 6-year-old strongest punch winner.
Final call for those 9-year-old strongest punchers. Final call. All right, let's make some noise for the 7-year-old strongest punch.
Thank you, sweetie.
Oh, Spencer.
Okay, take your new belt. For those of you who know how to tie your belt, put your belt on. But for the new students, take your new belt, put it in half just like this. Okay? That's what I'm showing you. Take your new belt, put it in half. A red belt means something. If you know what it means, and it's one word, tell me this. This I did with my procrastination on the ribbons. Okay, we're gonna do this. I want this roll so back a little bit. So back a little bit. If anybody has a video camera that's digital and that takes like MP3s or whatever, I have never videotaped one of my break-ins. The only thing don't do, don't stand up.
Please don't break your hand.
What's that? My hand? I will try not to. But you know what? I have like 3 weeks to heal before our next class, so I should be good.
There she goes. Woohoo! There goes Kim. All right. Here she comes again. I'm waiting for Rick and Jay to catch a good one. I haven't gotten them yet. No. Here he goes. Here he goes. Go, Rick, go. him. Some other little boy we don't know. Come on, girl. Kirsten. Kirsten.